All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming today. So great to have you all here. We're seeing the numbers of attendees starting to tick up on Zoom and on our Facebook Live. So since it's 4 p.m., we're going to go ahead and get started to make sure we get through the presentation and also have time to take some of your questions at the end. My name is Zoe Dirksen-Salm. I'm here on behalf of Point Reyes National Seashore Association, the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service at Point Reyes. We do a lot of work related to conservation to protect habitat and species at our park. And one of those species is the sea otter. And so we are so excited to be here today in partnership with Sea Otter Savvy to bring you this amazing talk on the impact of recovering sea otters on commercially important crabs in California. I just want to make a note that there, as I said, there will be a Q&A at the end. It is, if you're on Zoom, you'll see a little icon at the bottom of your screen. It'll have two little chat bubbles and it'll say Q&A. You can just click on that and type in your questions. If you're on Facebook, you can just go ahead and directly put your questions as a comment on the Facebook Live. Yes, and as a reminder, you can ask questions at any point throughout the presentation, but we won't be answering questions until the end. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Heather Barron with Sea Otter Savvy.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So yes, hi, my name is Heather Barrett and I'm the Science Communication Director with Sea Otter Savvy. And I want to thank you all for joining us for day 3 of Sea Otter Awareness Week. So Sea Otter Awareness Week, it occurs every year during the last full week of September, so you can already mark your calendar for next year. And it is organized in partnership this year with Sea Otter Savvy, the Defenders of Wildlife, California State Parks, Alaka Alliance, and Monterey Bay Aquarium. And we also want to thank all of our collaborators that join us in spreading awareness for this week. And this year is especially important. It is the 20th anniversary, and the theme is Path to Coexistence. And this is us really celebrating the progression towards a more positive relationship between people and sea otters. Another thing I wanted to note is that this week also highlights Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program, which we educate communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters and offer them a survey for community involvement. So the Southern Sea Otter Range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south to Año Nuevo State Park in the north, a little north of that. And sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast. And so they are ecologically as well as culturally significant. And there's increasing discussion regarding possible reintroduction to historical habitats. So to move forward, government agencies, as well as the Sea Otter research community, we really need to hear from you. We need to engage stakeholders and hear your perspectives. So if you're wondering an action item that you can do, please take the Sea Otter stakeholder survey and share your thoughts on possible reintroduction. Your concerns, your questions, your voice, it really does matter. So the links and the websites and all of that's going to be made available to you through this program. And so with that, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Rebecca Lewison. She is a professor of biology at San Diego State University. And as a conservation ecologist, her research focuses on the impact of resource and land use on vulnerable wildlife populations that face pressing conservation challenges in both terrestrial and marine environments. Her projects also explore coupled human natural populations and systems around the world. And what unites her research is a common focus, understanding the complex relationships between human and ecological processes using innovative field, quantitative, and lab-based approaches to advance applied conservation science. And today we are so thrilled that she's going to be speaking on behalf of Tracy Grimes for her research on the impact of recovering sea otters on commercially important California crabs. So take it away, Rebecca.
Okay, I'm not going to leave my camera on for the whole time, but I just want to have it on just for a moment as I introduce myself. So Heather just gave the great introduction for what I'll be talking about today. And as she mentioned, I am here instead of Tracy Grimes. That's whose research we're going to be hearing about today and who wasn't able to join us. But I had the privilege of serving as Tracy's advisor. I'm just going to go ahead and turn my camera off here. 1 second. Am I going to turn my camera off? Yes, I am. I had the privilege of serving as Tracy's advisor while she completed her master's degree in my lab at SDSU. And Tracy's project was really a lovely synergy of several of my areas areas of expertise. A large part of my research focuses specifically on sustainable fisheries, protected species, and I serve on NOAA's Marine Mammal Pacific Scientific Review Group. So I'm going to advance my slides. Yes, here we go. So let's start just by talking about otters and what we know about their role in ecological systems. And I'm guessing many of you on this call may already know that otters serve very important roles as a predator. In fact, sea otters are and specifically sea otters of the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, are used as the textbook example for something we call a trophic cascade. And what a trophic cascade is basically animals exerting influence on systems through what they eat. So in the Aleutians, because sea otters consume sea urchins, without them, when sea otters are removed, what we have is something called urchin barrens. So without the grazing, without sea otter predation, urchins can overrun a system. And so an urchin barren looks like the one that you see here on the, oh, I can move my thing, that you see here on the right. So areas associated with otter presence have productive kelp, and areas where otter populations no longer present are unproductive urchin barrens. So that's telling us a lot about otters and how they influence community structure through their influence on prey systems. I'm guessing a lot of you who are on the call may also know that, like other predators, otters have been affected by humans. They were, because of the quality of their fur, they were hunted to near extinction in the 18th and 19th centuries. They gained protection when the Fur Seal Treaty was enacted in 1911. The population of California was thought to be extinct, but in 1938, there was a remnant population discovered, and with the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1972 and the Marine Mammal Protection Act later, there's been really successful otter conservation and protection, and it's worked. And Heather was just talking to us about the current distribution of where they used to be, but also where they still are. There has been slow population growth in California, and as everyone probably knows, that in Southern California, we have a subspecies of sea otter, and that ranges, as Heather was telling us, from south of San Francisco to Santa Barbara. And I think it's really useful to know that, and note that the management and policy measures, again, have been effective. The population has slowly been increasing over the last 25 years, although, as Heather also mentioned, recent population assessments have found that range expansion and or reintroductions will likely be necessary for this population to continue to grow. So if you're on this call because you are a supporter of otter populations, that sounds like probably good news to you. But for other people, and I certainly consider myself both of these camps that are focused on sustainable fisheries, that rate has raised some concerns. And as Heather mentioned, one of the concerns is potential for otter-human resource competition. Turns out that otters have really expensive tastes in what they eat. And they eat a lot of different things. They eat abalone, they eat sea urchins, they eat some of the other things that, well, sea cucumbers, which are harvested, but certainly the thing that's on their list that they really like to eat, in particular that has people concerned, is Dungeness crabs. If you don't know about Dungeness crabs, and maybe you know a little bit more about otters, but you might know about Dungeness crabs as well, but you would know that Dungeness crab is a highly prized, highly valued fishery in California. It's often the most profitable fishery in the state of California. Each year, the fishery, which is very regulated, harvests adult crabs. They closely follow the quotas. And you may think to yourself, but wait a minute, this isn't what sea otters eat. And that's true. These where adult Dungeness crab are caught are in waters that are far deeper than sea otters would ever dive. They're not known to be particularly deep divers, but to have a sustainable fishery, you need to be able to recruit juveniles. And that's where the overlap comes into play, because juvenile Dungeness crab use estuaries as nursery habitat. So before we talk a little bit about otters, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about crabs. So there's still actually a lot we don't know about crabs, and I'm not a crab expert, I will put that out there, but I've certainly learned a lot about the system through this research. What we do know is that they have, this is the life cycle of a Dungeness crab. They go through some crazy state changes. And what we know that when they become this post-metamorphic juvenile, that many, not all, but many Dungeness crab use estuaries as a nursery. What does that mean? It's a nursery. It means it's a place that they're just like our nurseries, where they're growing and getting bigger. And that we know that Dungeness crab in nurseries get bigger faster than Dungeness crab that settle in coastal environments. We also know that Dungeness crab, once they're in an estuary, don't just stay in one place. They use a variety of habitat types. So what do we mean? We mean they might be in seagrass in the estuary, or they might be in reefs, or even unvegetated habitat. So that's a little background on Dungeness crab that you need to know for this story to make sense. Yeah, so this is the stage that we're most concerned about the interaction with otters and Dungeness crab, not the adult. So what's the problem? Well, otters also use estuaries. Estuaries it's not maybe the typical perspective or take on sea otter habitat, but otters historically have used and occupied estuaries. They also use other coastal seagrass and salt marsh habitats. But we think that estuaries are going to be, have been, and will continue to be important for population growth. And again, as Heather mentioned in her intro, particularly given the recommendation and the finding in recent sea otter population assessments that range expansion and reintroduction is likely, it's something being considered. It's possible if sea otters recolonize estuaries and bays, we need to have a better understanding of what the positive impacts of that could be. And we'll talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about trophic cascades and how otters support natural systems, but there may be negative interactions or potential conflicts there as well. And so really that's where Tracy's line of inquiry kind of came into being, is her thinking this through and thinking, wow, we need to know more about what we need to use the existing data that we have to answer this potential question of potential conflicts. So she split her research into two parts. And so I'm going to do the same thing. And the first one is to take a deep dive into Elkhorn Slough, one particular estuary where there are a lot of sea otters, and see how information about what's happened in Elkhorn Slough can inform our understanding of what potential conflicts might be. And then the second is to look beyond just that single estuary and look up and down the coast to compare both crab populations and see if there's any evidence of otters and already impacts on the Dungeness crab fishery. So that's, we're going to cover these two different topics. Just as a spoiler, if for those of you, I mean, I'm guessing most of the folks on the call, maybe you yourself are in the research community or you're familiar with how this whole research enterprise works. The spoiler is we don't just do one study and answer the question, right? I wish that it were, but it doesn't work that way. But I think what is important to realize is I think by the end of this, we're going to know more than we did than when we started. So just to manage our expectations. Okay, so the first part is this deep dive into one particular estuary, and that one particular estuary is Elkhorn Slough in the center of Monterey Bay. And you may be familiar with this area depending on where you are living. But Elkhorn Slough, if you didn't know, has the highest concentration of otters in California. It was colonized first in around the 1980s which was a group of about 20 male otters near the mouth of the estuary. Don't think there were any breeding females, and it wasn't really until the early 2000s when females and pups began to establish residency, and the population at that point started growing much more rapidly until around 2013. So we think the population is around 130 otters. Now, otters in Elkhorn, because of where they are, it's near the aquarium, it's pretty accessible, have really been the focus of considerable research. What kind of research, you may ask? Well, one research is kind of talking about what I led off with talking about. We're looking here in the upper right-hand corner, if you can see where I'm pointing. And that's what I was talking about before, this thing called trophic cascades. So this was research that was done by Brent Hughes and colleagues, who found that sea otters can support seagrass growth. You may ask, how can they do that? But it's because they're indirectly increasing seagrass growth as a function of consuming the prey that eat seagrass, right? And so that's by eating algal consumers, they can promote seagrass growth. So that's one thing that sea otters do. They indirectly benefit seagrass growth. We also know that sea otters in this area, and that's because a lot of people were studying them, were largely eating what we call cancer crabs. That's the group that the Dungeness crab is in. And that certainly in the early years, 1990 to 2012, when the sea otter population really got established, they actually formed, not quite, but almost half of their diet. So they definitely like juvenile Dungeness crab. And we know that there are benefits to having sea otters in a particular estuary. What Tracy was really interested in asking is how the Dungeness crab population may have changed between when the crab population was initially, when this research by Brent Hughes was initially done, and more recently, since the otter population in the slough has slowed, hasn't continued to increase. Sorry. So to do this, she tapped into a lot of data sets. She collected new data, but one of the most important things she did, I thought, is do a fantastic job leveraging the data that other people had collected, that had already been collected over time, both on crabs and on sea otters. For sea otters, there's a rich data set, and maybe some of you were observers of collecting that data, of censusing otters throughout the Elkhorn Slough. So trained observers for those censuses go out with scopes, you can see one here, and they identify where the location of otters are. So that's how we get information on density. You'll hear me use that word, just how many otters are in a particular area. And they can also get information on what are they doing? Are they foraging? Are they grooming? Are they resting? And in some cases, you can actually see what they're eating. You kind of see if you've got a good spotting scope and if you've got a good angle, you can actually see not just what they're eating, but the size of what they're eating. So this sea otter data was really critical because it gave us information of where otters were and what they were doing in Elkhorn Slough. And you can kind of just get a sense of these different zones in the estuary. And we've got areas of seagrass, which we mentioned the Dungeness crab are sometimes in. We have unvegetated areas, that's little mud blobs. And we have these different zones of where the sea otters are. So you're going to see this map come up. Now, Tracy also collected new data on crab abundance and size, and she did that by using these handy dandy traps that that Dungeness crabs can crawl into. They can't get eaten when they're in there. And she put these, again, in these different zones, in these different habitat types, the unvegetated habitat type and the seagrass habitat. So let's start finding out, what did Tracy learn? Well, one of the things she learned, and this is just, again, analyzing the existing sea otter information, that the census data that was there. What we're looking at here is sea otter foraging density. So density is just literally how many otters are foraging in a particular area. And the color ramp goes from high, which is a lot of sea otters foraging in red, to lower in blue. And what you can see is that between 2012 and 2016, there have been substantial changes in where sea otters have been foraging. What kind of changes? Well, you can probably see them for yourself. In 2012, otters were primarily concentrated around Seal Bend. And by 2016, we can see that they've gone way farther up the estuary and are more evenly distributed, right? It used to be that there was sort of a clump of them here. So that tells us that, okay, sea otter foraging patterns, both in terms of how many are in one area and where they are, has changed. Oh yeah, that's Seal Bend, like I just pointed to. Now, based on the crab abundance data, right? So this is from the crab traps. These are graphs, and sometimes we think graphs are scary, but these are not scary graphs. What we're looking at here is how sea otter density, so it's getting bigger in this direction, is potentially related to Dungeness crab abundance. So we're going to look at abundance and we're going to look at size. That's what two graphs are telling us. And the two colors are just helping us keep track of the year. 2012 and 2016 in red. So what we can see here on this graph on screen left is that crab abundance declined between 2012 and 2016. And there seemed to be a negative relationship with the density of foraging sea otters. Tracy also found that the size distribution, so how big the crabs are, and we say a distribution, but all that is a fancy word for saying the range. If we took a measure of all the crabs we found, what's the range of crabs? And what we're looking at here is that in 2012, there were bigger crabs than there were in 2016, right? There were more crabs that were smaller in 2016. So this does seem to suggest that in Elkhorn Slough, in these particular locations, there may be a relationship between sea otter foraging and Dungeness crab, both abundance, that's how many there are, and the size of the crabs. Tracy also found an interesting relationship between crab size, sea otter density, and habitat type. Remember, I mentioned that we find crabs and otters in seagrass and in unvegetated areas. So otters were most likely to forage in unvegetated habitat. That's the red dots here. She found a significant relationship between sea otter density, the habitat type, and the size. So we're just kind of putting all these pieces together. So this is telling us that Dungeness crab are smaller in unvegetated habitat, where sea otter density was higher. Okay, so what did we learn here? We learned a couple things. We learned that there was definitely a change in Dungeness crab size and abundance between 2012 and 2016. We learned that otters may be related to that change, right? Because we did detect a concurrent change in sea otter density. And we also learned that smaller crabs, she found in Elkhorn Slough smaller crabs where the otters were foraging, and that it did seem to coincide with also with a shift in sea otter diet. So that finding is really corroborated by the fact that in an independent data set found that sea otter diets shifted during the same time period from Dungeness crab to other things as well. Okay, so that tells us things about a particular estuary, a particular place, but for the second part of her research, Tracy really wanted to go beyond just Elkhorn Slough and look into other estuaries and in California, where there may be otters in other locations, to Also asked, is there any evidence of abundance, an impact of otters on the abundance and size of crabs in those locations? And again, I think this is an important a next step, sort of good part two, because we want a clearer idea of how otters may already be impacting crab populations, or think ahead to how it could impact crab populations if they were recolonized other estuaries in California beyond their current range. Okay, so for this second part of Tracy's sort of larger scale research, she considered 4 different areas. So Elkhorn Slough is what we were just talking about. Here it is. That's where we have an established population. She looked at 2 other estuaries that have been identified as potential reintroduction sites. So that's Drake's Estero in San Francisco Bay. And then also included Morro Bay, which has some otters, but it's not extensively used. So Morro Bay is similar to how otters were in Elkhorn Slough, like in the beginning, in the late 80s and early 90s, where there were sea otters using, you know, the harbor area or the mouth, but they really weren't established in other parts of the estuary. Now, for this part of her research, Tracy couldn't do everything everywhere, so she identified partners of people who were already collecting Dungeness crab data, and that's who we're seeing our fantastic network of partners who she worked collaboratively with other scientists at CSUs, at the National Park Service, who were already collecting crab data in these other study sites. A wonderful example of what we can do when we work together and pool our resources. And so these folks had already collected data on crab size and abundance. So that's one piece of information and that we can fit into the puzzle. The other thing that Tracy was able to also wanted to consider was whether there any relationship between changes in southern sea otter populations, the trends that we've seen at the state level, and what the trends were in the Dungeness crab fishery. Not necessarily, maybe just to basically ask the question, well, if this is a huge problem and if sea otter populations are growing, do we see any influence on the Dungeness crab fishery landings right now? So for that, again, this is not data that Tracy collected, and for this, she's leveraging CDF, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife reports on commercial Dungeness crab landings from 2000 to 2014, that period of big population growth. And again, relying on now not just the Elkhorn Slough she used before the Elkhorn Slough census data, but now this is an annual USGS California sea otter census from that same time period. Okay, so what did she find out at this scale? So at this scale, Tracy found that sites with otters, so our sites with otters are here in red, our sites without otters are in green, and this is Morro Bay, Elkhorn Slough, San Francisco Bay, and Drake's Estero. So Tracy found that sites that had with otters, those are the ones in red, had significantly lower crab abundance than site without otters. We're looking at this one right now. First, we're just looking at abundance. So this is the number of crabs that she found. So these were the estuaries that are used by otters, and these are the ones that aren't. Now, what did she find in terms of size? She also found that crabs were significantly smaller also at sites with otters, and the biggest crabs were in Drake's Estero. Now, you may ask yourself, hey, wait a minute, I've been to these places, and I know there's differences among those estuaries, among those bays, and it's not just otters or no otters. What about all the other things? What about temperature? What about salinity? And I don't have those data on the screen, but just know that Tracy tested for everything. We call those abiotic factors or abiotic conditions. She tested for all of those, and none of those explained the differences that she observed. Does it mean it's all about otters? No, because that's not how we can interpret the data, but it certainly seems to suggest it's at least not the other abiotic conditions that she tested. The next question that member Tracy wanted to ask is, okay, so do we see any evidence that this growing this growing sea otter population has influenced Dungeness crab landings? If you happen to be in the crab fishery, you already know that Dungeness crabs are harvested and landed at lots of different sites. The most landings actually occur in Eureka and the northern landing sites, right? Eureka and San Francisco, they have the most landings, period. You'll see these scales are not the same. In general, Dungeness crab landings have increased in certainly many areas, but the biggest thing that you probably notice is there's a lot of variation in landings across the years, even if we take into account the fact that some areas have more landings. There's overall been an increase, certainly from Bodega to Morro Bay, and Monterey and Morro Bay are the two regions that overlap the most with the otter range. These are the two ones in red that we see here, and they've demonstrated a significant increase in landings. And when we use these two locations right here, Morro Bay and Monterey, and correlated them with the otter population counts, there's no real relationship, right? And that's no relationship if we look, there's a couple other graphs I'm going to show on here, and it says the word lag. Basically what Tracy was testing is, well, maybe they don't change in exactly at the same time. So what if I assume that it takes a little while for the effects of sea otters to exert its influence on the fishery? So that's why we test these lags on the right. But the bottom line is, overall, if we compare Dungeness crab landings, that's what we've got here, and the number of sea otters range-wide using these average counts, both are increasing, whether we look year by year or we consider this time lag idea. And this makes sense. And we can put this together with the information that Tracy found out, even in Elkhorn Slough. So when we look at these larger scale, estuaries across a larger area, it does seem to suggest that crabs are more abundant and larger when there aren't otters. Those differences aren't explained by abiotic conditions, which doesn't mean it's just otters, but at least it's not abiotic conditions. It doesn't explain the difference in crab abundance. But the otter population, even though it grew quite a lot in one particular area, doesn't seem to be having an impact on the fishery, which we wouldn't necessarily expect it to, even if it can impact otters, can impact nursery populations, right? Nursery populations, the relationship between nursery populations and those adults that are actually the target of the fishery is not something that we understand particularly well. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about this if people have questions about how can you have localized effects, but not effects at the fishery level. But the answer is you can, because we currently have it. This was a fantastic, I just want to give Tracy all the credit here, a really wonderful research project that resulted in publications, but also more importantly, these wonderful partnerships that Tracy established with amongst both the crab community, and then also I feel like that the fact that she had this opportunity to share her research with all of you in many different ways. And I think she's really committed to doing the outreach is wonderful. I wish she could be on the call so we could give her the accolades that she deserves for this, but I can give them for her, and you can all email her and tell her that you're really a big fan of her research. But with that, I'll pause. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has about what I think we understand to date about the system. I guess I'll just finish with, I'll stop sharing my screen. Finish with I think this was a wonderful example of the way that you know, when we engage in these scientific questions, it's a fantastic question to ask. It's not a one and done, but I do think Tracy's research filled in some of the gaps and addressed some of those questions, but obviously there are still more, and maybe that's what we'll talk about now together. So thanks everyone for listening, and happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you so much, Rebecca. And as a reminder to everyone, if you're on Zoom, you can just click the little button on your bottom toolbar to ask any questions. And if you're on Facebook, you can just leave it as a comment. And one of our first questions is from Lena. She was asking if you could just explain again what a landing is in reference to fisheries.
Oh, that is a great question. And I'm sorry that was it. So when we talk about landings, it just means how much crab was landed. Like how much crab did they harvest? That's what landings are. So it's the way that we measure sort of how is the fishery doing. If landings are declining, then it's telling us, you know, that the fishery is not finding what it needs. And so in this case, landings is telling us, no, they're able to, this is a quota. This is a very regulated fishery. So the quotas are set and they are meeting those quotas. So it's certainly telling us it's a thriving fishery.
Perfect, thank you. And Lena, please let us know if you need more explanation. Another question we have from Paige, she's wondering, do you think there would be major differences in how river otters versus sea otters affect their environments?
Well, that is a great question. And I think the answer is yes, but I honestly, I might have to defer to someone if they know more about river otters than I do, because I mostly just know about sea otters. There might be someone else. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think, let me just clarify the question. They want to know, do river otters have a similar sort of impact on, sorry, that's my toddler in the background. I think he's about to go on a walk. That they want to know more about if river otters have a similar impact on their community. Is that the question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't believe that river otters have been necessarily categorized as a keystone species as sea otters are. However, they are known to have a really critical role as a predator in their niche and in their ecosystems, as they do sort of have that similar top-down control, but their diet can be very, very varied, right? So they can eat fish, they can also eat lizards and other things on land as well. But their role is really important. And I know that they have been returning to some of the Bay Area estuaries as well, which is excellent to hear.
Great, thank you. That's good to know. We have another question from over Zoom. The question is, what proposals are on the table to address the tensions and conflicts between commercial crabbing and otters?
Heather, that might be another one that you know more about than I do. I'm aware of some of the conversations, and I think that Heather really set the stage where I do believe that there's a really open line of communication, and that's been established from like all the agencies that I'm aware of that are involved, because we recognize, or there's not me, but people recognize that for this to work, we really need folks there needs to be buy-in from different communities.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think at this stage, with any sort of pre-conversations and discussions about potential reintroduction, we already know from the scientists, from the organizations, from those that are in policy and management, we know that we really need to engage with these different stakeholders in fisheries, and we want to hear from them. We want to hear the concerns. We want to hear the questions that they have, because we can't move forward in having a conversation if we don't come together and really discuss what those concerns and questions are. And they have a very valid opinion. They have their livelihood at stake is how they would be feeling in this. And so we want to make sure that we are staying as open as possible, which is why, again, take that survey. If you know those that are maybe not necessarily interested in sea otter reintroduction, but have concerns about it, we want to hear from them as well. And so that is an open line of communication for them.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, as a reminder, there are some links in the chat of the Zoom call. I'll put them on Facebook as well, just so that folks can refer to those after this webinar. On a similar note, I do want to address that we did have some comments on both Zoom and Facebook about the audio levels of this call. And for anyone who is having any trouble hearing, we will try to fix any audio differences over in the recording. And so if you want to check back and maybe hear something that you missed, just feel free to check either on the Sea Otter Savvy YouTube or on our website.
Rats, I apologize.
It's okay.
That's part of doing live.
The world of Zoom.
The nice thing is we can always do stuff and add the captions later too. So that's always a good option.
Yeah. And I think there were captions on Facebook. So hopefully, and we had some comments of people saying that earbuds helped and things like that. So yeah. In the meantime, again, as we wait for more questions to come in, we do have another question. Luke is asking, what are your thoughts on how climate change is affecting vegetation, crabs, and otter population?
That is a great question. And I think that's something that a lot of my research really focuses on. And the impact, I mean, the answer is yes, it is affecting all of those things. One of the questions we ask a lot is like, who are going to be the climate winners and who are going to be the climate losers? Because, some of the, warmer temperatures can benefit certain species and not others. In this system, I would say, I don't actually, and we should add to that list, Dungeness crabs, right? Are they going to be a climate change winner or loser? So I think the answer is we're learning some things, but because that hasn't actually been the focus of a lot of exploration yet, I'd say the jury is really still out. In general, I think, well, I shouldn't say this. Certain fisheries can benefit under warmer conditions. I don't think the Dungeness crab is going to be one of them. In terms of sea otters, I think it's more likely that they're not going to have direct impacts from climate change, but it is going to be something indirect, like a change in habitat or a reduction in food that could potentially cause negative impacts. So, but it's a really great question. I mean, sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say, to kind of go off of that, I actually think that, the concept of climate change and sort of brings in sea otters as well as a lot of conversation around how sea otters can actually be, there's a term of climate change superheroes. So almost like the winners and losers, there could be some superheroes that come out from this as well, as a species that might help mitigate some of those impacts, just based on the fact that with their presence, there tends to be more kelp forest, there tends to be more eelgrass. Those have a lot of carbon can be sequestered in those environments as well, in those ecosystems. And then not only that, with eelgrass, having healthy beds can help with mitigating some of the flooding that might occur as well with climate change. So that's also, there needs to be a lot more research done on this, but that's definitely to be considered as well.
Great. Thank you both so much for those thoughtful answers. And we actually just had a question come in from Chris. Chris is asking to clarify, since it seems like Chris didn't quite catch this earlier, is the concern related to the Dungeness crab populations with regards to sea otters, or the predation by sea otters on crab nurseries?
Yes. So if that's the concern is not that sea otters aren't going after adult Dungeness crab. They can't get them. They're just too deep. So it is the impact that the concern is that the sea otter predation in these nursery habitats has a substantial impact on the number of, I'm not saying it does, but that's the research. The question, does it have a significant impact on those juveniles that form those adults, that recruit into those adults? And, for a lot of anybody who works in systems where there's, a lot of recruitment, so sea otters don't included in this, but like if you work in things like crabs or other things that have larvae, typically there is a lot of mortality, a lot of juveniles that don't make it into adulthood. So it could be that even though sea otters have very local, they clearly do, right, have effects at one particular nursery, that is a drop in the bucket for Dungeness crab. It could be, right? That's one of the sort of hypotheses, which is there's always, before humans came along, otters and crabs lived together for a long time, and there were still crabs and there were still otters. And so the system can self-regulate. Now, that doesn't mean that, I heard it on, Facebook that this lady said that there's never going to be, otters aren't going to do anything to Dungeness crabs. But that's one hypothesis, that they can't have an impact at the population level, even though they clearly do have a local effect on a particular nursery. So that's how those two ideas aren't in conflict with each other. That was tripping anybody up. But wait, she just said that they do impact abundance and size in this one place. It's just this one place is a teeny tiny place if you're a Dungeness crab larvae, right? So.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a bit of a lull in questions. As a reminder for Zoom folks, the Q&A question is on the button is on your bottom toolbar, and folks on Facebook can just comment. I'm wondering if in the meantime, Rebecca, you can talk about other avenues that folks can find your research and tap into the work you're doing.
Well, yeah, certainly on my website, which I guess I can share. I guess I can type it. Let's see, can I type it into? Well, if you Google me, it's you'll find me. But that's not maybe the nicest thing. But I don't have it queued up right now. But that's where if people are interested in more about the research going on in my lab, you can find it there.
Perfect. Well, in the time that you were sharing that, we had another question. So perfect. Margaret wonders if you can talk about how juvenile crabs get out of the estuary to the deep water in the ocean.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say that, one of the things when Tracy, we often have this idea of like, oh, we know a lot of things about like our natural systems. And the bottom line is we really don't know that much about Dungeness crabs. There are a lot of unanswered questions. I think, once they're at that large size, they're really just kind of walking. And that's how they move along to these deeper areas. But the whole, like, how long do each of these stages, if you remember that circle that I showed, how long do they last? What's the survival at each stage? It would be important. We don't know, which would be important to say, well, how much mortality is too much at this particular stage? But they absolutely do leave estuaries, as Margaret just said, and move to these deeper areas where they, when they reach a certain size threshold, which is probably related to the fact that then at that point, not very many things can get them, can eat them. So they're pretty safe from other sources of mortality. And they definitely don't spend much time in the coastal areas because otherwise we'd all be catching Dungeness crabs without pots, right? So they pretty quickly move to the deeper areas where only folks who were, fishing for crabs with crab pots can get them.
We also have a comment on Facebook that isn't really a question, but I think brings up a good a good thought. We had someone mention the fact that Drake's Estero is which is in our region of Point Reyes National Seashore, is part of an NPA, which means it's a no-take zone. And the comment is talking about how it seems like it might be a good place for sea otters. Is that a way that the conservationists are thinking about sea otter reintroduction, or NPA is part of that plan?
I think MPAs certainly have, we've done a tremendous amount in the state of California to protect, coastal waters. And that's been really important. And it does make a lot of sense to use those to benefit a lot of species. I guess, one of the things, again, that we need to understand is what are those localized effects going to be? But I definitely think that it's probably one of the reasons why it's on the candidate list. I guess, Heather, if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I know that a lot of people like to talk about certain locations that maybe have been, brought up in conversation around potential reintroduction. And I just want to kind of emphasize and make sure everyone knows that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service feasibility assessment that came out and was published, it did say that it's feasible. However, it is not a proposal. There are no locations that are chosen, and they recognize that any location that is discussed, a lot of those costs and benefits are really specific to a location, right? So if locations are to be considered, they all have to go through a very rigorous process of understanding how is that going to affect the economy, how is that going to affect certain fisheries, how is that going to affect the other species in that area. And so there's a lot to go into that. Drake, but the comment of saying that it is an MPA, it's protected. There's a lot of food source, there's prey availability there. It's an estuary. Those all look like great things. So hopefully as discussions continue to move forward and we engage with more stakeholders, perhaps Drake's Estero can be one of the locations that's thrown in the hat.
Amazing. Thank you both. And we are, again, out of questions, and I think that's okay because we're coming up on 5 p.m. As a reminder to everybody, we will be recording these and putting them on the Sea Otter Savvy YouTube and on our website, and they'll live on Facebook as well. So you can continue to ask questions and we'll try to field them. I think, Heather, I'd like to turn over to you to maybe wrap this up.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you so much for the Point Reyes National Seashore Association, it's a tongue twister, for hosting this event. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for coming to talk to us more about Tracy Grimes research and the research that you do. It's so important for us to hear from the researchers at the ground up. And I also want to make that plug that, as you mentioned, there's so much more to learn, and that's why funding research is so important. So as we want to learn more about moving forward, there has to be more research done. To end, I'm just going to do my final plug, that your voice really does matter. If you're watching this and you're interested to learn more about potential reintroduction, the conversations around that, please check out the We Were Here website on the Sea Otter Savvy website. Please take the survey and share it with others that you think would be interested. All of you are stakeholders that are listening to this, and we want to hear your questions, your concerns, and ideas that you have. So definitely please share all of that with us. And with that, I thank you guys all for being here today. And yeah, I'll turn it back to to Zoe.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Rebecca, it's been amazing having you here to talk. And please, everyone, check out the rest of the webinars that are celebrating Sea Otter this week.
You can find them all at the Defenders website. There's a calendar of events. We have Float Down the Coast is going to be happening tomorrow. We've got talks from Edward Greger talking more about economic, costs and benefits of sea otter reintroduction. And so we've got tons more. So definitely check it out.
Perfect. All right. Have a great night or morning, whatever time anyone is tuning in here. Thank you again. Bye.
Bye.